can you see it?
Yeah, no problem. Crackerjack.
Right, whenever you're ready, good luck.
Oh, is it on?
Yeah, it's recording, so I'll just cut the beginning off and the end.
Right.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Right. Hello. Hello, I'm Callum Sharp, and this is my old versus new of Mice and Men, the 1939 version and the 1992 version. It's set in the Great Depression. George and Lenny, the two main characters, two jobless fellows looking for work. So they come across a ranch where they have the work slips and they can actually get a job there. The original was directed by Lewis Milestone, director of films like Two Arabian Nights, All Quiet on the Western Front, and the original Ocean's 11. The remake was directed by Gary Sinise, who is not a professional director or producer, as he did both direct, produce, and he also starred as George in the film. In terms of his acting career, he would go on to be in films like Forrest Gump, Apollo 13, and play the role of Detective Mac Taylor in CSI. This is the original of Mice and Men. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any specific financial information about the film, so instead I took financial information about a film called, difficult to pronounce, Ninochka. Yes, a comedy film that came out the exact same year, 1939, and I was able to calculate its budget, box office, gross profit, gross margin, and markup. You can see there. So it can be assumed that of Mice and Men had a similar budget, box office, gross profit, etc., as they were released in the same year. Also, it's worth noting that of Mice and Men was released the same year as a very famous political film called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, starring Jimmy Stewart. And both films were about contemporary affairs, and they came out the same year, so both can be considered on par with each other. A little bit of trivia there. Lon Chaney Jr. had to wear special shoes to increase his height by 6 inches, because he's a very big person. The remake, much like the original film, I couldn't find a lot of information apart from its gross profit and box office. So I did a little bit of calculating, that's what I came up with. Although, in terms of the 90s, the film did quite poorly at the box office. However, it got quite good critical reception and has gained a cult following over the years. And if you were to study of Mice and Men in secondary school, you would most likely see this film as opposed to the original. A little bit of trivia: the girl in the red dress running through the field at the beginning of the movie is played by his wife. Technologies. Quite difficult to come across, but I did manage to find quite a bit of info. The original was shot in 35mm film with an aspect ratio of 1.37. The camera format wasn't obtainable, but with films this old, they came out in the 30s, that's to be expected. A lot of the technologies in the 30s weren't yet patented, and various camera technologies were among these types. The remake was shot in 35mm film using a Panavision camera and lens with an aspect ratio of 1.84. Unlike a lot of films that came out in the 90s, it didn't use any special effects or CGI or indeed any major action scenes, except for a couple of minor practical effects, like the bit where Lenny crushes Curly's hand. Basically blood seeps out of the wound that he creates. It's pretty minor. Distribution and exhibition. The original was distributed by United Artists and released on December 30th, 1939, but not in England, as a lot of films back then They weren't sort of imported around, specifically to places that far in Europe and indeed the UK. But disappeared for many years at times, so it occasionally popped up but sort of disappeared for a little while. And it was revived in the 80s and 90s in revival theatres. The remake was distributed by MGM and released on October 2nd, 1992, but released in the UK in November 27th. Not that surprising, considering that Dark Knight Rises was released almost 6 months before it was released here. Trends. It's kind of ironic that when the original came out, remakes were becoming incredibly popular. So they're beginning to make a lot of remakes from the 20s, like Alice in Wonderland and Cleopatra. However, this one doesn't really fall into any of the 30s trends, as what was falling into trends there were horror films like Dracula, as you can see, sequels, some Kong, and spin-offs like Dracula's Daughter. The remake also doesn't fall into any major categories, as it sort of stands on its own. As it says there, the development of CGI technology, the rise of independent studios like Miramax and Lionsgate. Disney were beginning to make their mark with animated films like Little Mermaid and Lion King. And the home video market was also beginning to increase. So overall, the remake didn't fall into any major trends of the 90s as much as the original didn't fall into any major trends of the 30s. This is just a cast list and different people who played the same character. All the characters pretty much had the exact same name except for Curly's wife, who in the original was called May. And I'll get to that in a second. This is a star comparison. Here we have George Milton, one of the main characters of the film. In the original, he was played by Burgess Meredith. He was 32 when he starred in the film, and this more or less started his career as it was one of the first films he ever did. And he went on to star in films like Clash of the Titans, the original, Rocky 1 and 2, and he even went on to play the Penguin in the 1960s Batman show. Gary Sinise was 37 when he produced, directed and starred in Of Mice and Men. Much like Meredith, it was more or less beginning his career, and Sinise would later go on to star in films like Forrest Gump, Truman and Apollo 13. Lon Chaney Jr. He was 33 when he starred in Of Mice and Men. On a whole, he had done a lot more films than Burgess Meredith, but they were subpar and they weren't very popular. Not a lot of people know a lot about them. They're sort of very indie. But it could be argued that Of Mice and Men launched Chaney's career at the end of the 30s, because in the 40s horror was getting even more popular, and he went on to play the Wolfman, and he even went on to play more horror villains like Alucard, Son of Dracula, and the Mummy, and at one point I think Frankenstein as well. John Malkovich, he was 35 when he starred in the remake, but he'd already done a number of films before that, like Places in the Heart, The Killing Fields, and Death of a Salesman. But he's now gone on to do films like Red, being John Malkovich, of course, and The Line of Fire, even. May/Curly's wife. Betty Field was 23 when she starred in the original. As one of her very first movies, that came out the same year she began acting. She would later go on to star in films like The Great Gatsby and The Bus Stop. Sherilyn Fenn was 27 when she played her role in Mice and Men. Unlike Field, Fenn's character didn't have a name and was much smaller, in keeping with the theme of the book. But as in the original, the wife had quite a big part, I decided to compare the two of them. She would later create a TV career, starring in Friends, Dawson's Creek, and Law and Order. Social and political regulatory factors. Now, there's a character in the book, well, in both films, called Crooks, who's an African American, and bear in mind this was set in the 30s, so racism was very, very popular at the time, and it's interesting to think that this was actually made only 7 years after the book came out, so you could assume that racism was still quite high. Yeah, in both the book, the play, and the film, the character was not subjugated to, typical racist African American stereotypes that would have been popular during the 1930s. And also the characters don't really treat him with anguish either. I'm not quite sure what it was like on set. They may have been horrible to the actor, but the actor himself had actually played crooks on stage, so he clearly had experience with the character. But the character himself is very bitter. He's very pessimistic, but at the same time he's very lonely. So even if someone comes into his shack, which he's subjugated to, he'll talk down to them. He'll make them feel bad, but nonetheless he'd like them to stay. And there's a scene in it where Lenny comes in and he's acting pessimistic, but they end up turning to one another's sides, and he becomes one of the main protagonists as opposed to an antagonist, which would be most likely something you would become during that time. Another factor is Lenny's mental deficiency. It's not said in the book if he actually does have what would have retardation, as it would have been called then. At no point in the book or the film or the play or whatever does anyone ever say that he has a problem in his brain. And I believe the reason why they've done that is because in these times people who had mental deficiencies were locked up, left for dead or both. Horrible things they were experimented on, horrible things happened to them, and the idea is that no one ever says this. No one ever says that Lenny has this problem. That allows him to do things that a normal person would, because people assume he's a normal person, just a bit dopey, really. And of course, George probably knows, but he cares a lot for Lenny, and he wouldn't let anyone hurt him. Synergies. Very interesting. This is what I was interested in. In the original is based off the play by George S. Kaufman, whereas the original is based off the book itself. Meredith in the original plays George is a much more upbeat guy. It's very sort of happy, very chipper, whereas the one in the remake is a lot more sort of stern and sort of quiet, much like the character in the book. In the book and the remake, Curly's wife isn't given a name. She's just Curly's wife, whereas in the film, she's given the name May, which is also quite interesting, considering that she didn't have a name either in the play, but I haven't seen the play. So. Both Candys in the movies are sympathetic, but the one in the original, you feel a lot more emotion for. You feel sorry for him when his dog dies. You can tell that he really wants, with this dream that he has, that he remembers all these good times, and you feel sorry for him. The remake is good too, but again, closer to the book, he doesn't have a lot to say except in various points. Again, Candy in the original seems more realistic. In the original, it romanticizes its music score, which is very good, to get across very powerful moods, whereas in the remake it's more of an atmosphere that gets across a lot of the moods and, the key word, atmosphere, to let it sink in. The original, Lenny's death is off screen to build atmosphere, to build tension. The camera pans off and you hear the gunshot. Whereas in the remake, it's very blunt, very sharp and very to the point, just bang, he dies. Just falls to the ground, and then just the sound fades out. In the beginning of the original, Lenny's hiding a dead bird in his pocket, which he strokes because that's the kind of person he is. George takes it from him, throws it away. In the remake and in the book, he has a dead mouse in his pocket. George throws it away, but in the remake and the book, he chases after it. Both films are, interesting enough, both films open up with George and Lenny being chased out of weed after Lenny does something wrong. He makes a mistake. Well, this scene isn't in the book. They talk about the moment, but the scene isn't actually in the book. Vertical and horizontal integration. What I got from this is, the original was actually distributed by United Artists when it was its own company in 1939. but was re-released by Favourite Films in 1946. The remake was distributed by MGM, as I said before, who ironically would later become one of the main producers of United Artists, the company that distributed the original, so it sort of comes to full circle. So, this is my 50 cents. Even though the new film isn't technically considered a remake as it's based off the book as opposed to a play, it still hits all the key scenes, key notes, key characters. So I do consider them one an original and one a remake. The remake puts a lot more emphasis on atmosphere, as I said before, and it focuses on how the setting affects the characters and how the characters cope with their situation. The original, on the other hand, puts a lot more emphasis into character development, emphasis on storyline, and actually makes the protagonist very likeable. And the antagonist much more realistic, and he's not much more of a mastermind or mad or anything. He's just a bit of a git, really. He's not a nice person, and he's very insecure about it. He's little man syndrome. And honestly, that's what makes it a more likeable movie. That's what makes it more likeable. I mean, the characters are likeable, the setting is likeable, the story is likeable. And it makes it, the remake is good, it's very engaging, not to mention it's closer to the book. But it's the original that gets you invested in what you want to see out of this not complex, but the setting, this story, this plot, what you want to see. So I do think that the remake is definitely worth a watch if you've read the book, but I think the one that you should probably look at, probably see primarily, is the original. It is in black and white, but that doesn't bother me, and it shouldn't really bother you either. It's the importance of storytelling, atmosphere, character development which makes a film work, not whether or not it's got special effects or if it's in colour or whatever. That's what makes it important, and the original has more of that than the remake. And so here is my star rating. I've given the original 4 out of 5 and the remake 3 out of 5, and I think that's quite an appropriate rating for these two films. And yes, that's my 52 cents. That's my old versus new of Mice and Men, 1939 and 1992. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. End of slideshow.